What's up, everybody? Welcome back, and thank you so much for listening and subscribing to Anthro for the Homies. I'm truly blown away at the amount of support that I've received, especially support from around the world. People are listening in all kinds of countries, such as the Philippines, Norway, Denmark. Shout out to the homies that are listening in the Philippines, Norway, Denmark. Seriously, if you're not in the United States and you're listening to Anto for the Homies, then please hit me up. I'm serious. I'd like to send you a t-shirt. It's the least I could do for listening to my podcast. And you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at Anthro for the Homies. I mostly check Instagram and Twitter, so those are, the best places to hit me up. You can also follow the podcast at anthroforthehomies.podbean.com. That sort of serves as like a landing page in which you can see all the different episodes and read the different thumbnails or read the different descriptions and look through the different thumbnails. I also wanted to give a shout out to Lena J. Lena J left me a review on January 15th, 2021. So thank you so much, Lena J. It's a 5-star review entitled Great Show. Awesome content, relatable guests, and host. Highly recommend for those who are into anthropology or want to learn more about anthropology. So thank you so much, Lena J. I truly appreciate it. That's awesome they left me a review. Also, shout out to Amanda F89 on December 18th, 2020. She said, this podcast offers a refreshing new perspective in the really interesting field of anthropology. I don't really know what anthropology is, but David breaks it down for me in a super simple way. David also has a great voice for podcasting. Oh, thank you so much. And his first episode with Roxanne was unlike anything I've heard. Looking forward to the next one. So Amanda F89 and Lena J, thank you both so much for your review. I truly appreciate it. And if anybody else would like to leave me an honest review, please, I'd love for you to be honest, even if it's brutal. I take constructive criticism in a positive manner. So even if it's a little bit brutal, please let me know what you think of the podcast. Let me know what kind of guests you'd like to be on, or if you have any specific questions that you'd like me to answer on the podcast. That would be great and very much appreciative. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy the next episode. Welcome to another episode of Anthro for the Homies. Today is pretty cool. I'm really stoked because this is the first time in the studio that I'll be having a guest for the second time. And his name is John C. Ulloa. He holds 2 degrees, one of them being a master's in history with emphasis in Latin American history. The second degree is in anthropology with an emphasis in visual anthropology. He's a father, husband, professor of history and cultural anthropology at Skyline College. He's also a drummer in a band, an author, lowrider, car builder, and all-around badass, Mr. John C. Ulloa. Please say hi, John. How you doing today, man?
Hey, what's up, David? Thanks for having me back. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you again. I knew after the first podcast we did that, you were going to be a repeat guest. So here it is, man. I'm super happy that we could do it again. We have a pretty cool talk for you guys, pretty cool talk planned for today. Today, we wanted to talk about fieldwork, essentially, and how students can go from the classroom, from taking a class like John's class, right? What does it mean? How do you go from sitting in a seat to then execute, planning your field work, developing a topic around it, executing your field work, and then, what happens after that. So I really want to give John a chance to go ahead and start. So, John, a little bit, how did you first get into field work? Like what was the first actual quote unquote field work, anthropological field work that you did?
Wow. That's a tough question. You know what I mean? Because it's like, before when I was on and we were talking about, everybody has that inner anthropologist, right? Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of bringing that out. And that's what I try to stress to my students. When you think about, when you go into, a social setting, people start looking around, and people start, and I like to use the club for as an example, right? Like you go into a club right? You start scanning the room, right? And then, I asked women, and, I ask everybody really, like, what are your thoughts when you're doing that? Keep it real. What are you doing? You're like, oh, I can't believe they're wearing that. Or, right? I go, and what you're doing is you're doing the comparative approach. Essentially, you're comparing, and ultimately that comparison boils down to how everybody is faring in the human, or in the very Darwinian sense, the competition for mating, essentially in a club context, and but that comparative approach is, you're kind of comparing your surroundings to yourself, and you're trying to get a better understanding of self based on comparing the experience, quote unquote, in the field to your own, kind of cultural framework. So I guess, as far back as I can remember, I've always been interested in how people live, and I'm consciously avoiding the use of the word other, right? Other people live. I'm just curious in terms of, like, I love cross cultural analysis. You know what I mean? I mean, like, I remember, like, as a kid, we didn't really use you. I mean, we had utensils on the table, but we mostly used tortillas to eat, and that's all technique, And so my friends would come over, or my brother and sister's friends would come over, and they would see us eating, and they would want to do it, And so they would try, but then, they would have, like, sauce running down their arms or whatever, because they had their technique messed up, So, but those are all, like, examples of, like, putting yourself in a different cultural context than what you're used to in order to gain a better understanding about your world. You know what I'm saying? And your ethos and worldview and whatnot. So, I mean, technically, I've been doing participant observation field work my whole life. It just wasn't formalized. I would say that, to answer your question directly, it was really in graduate school that I was forced to actually do, like, theoretically applied fieldwork methods and, employ methodologies. So I guess that was like 04-ish.
Okay.
05.
Okay. And what was the topic, or what was the subject of your fieldwork at that time?
All right. So when I did my master's degree in history, what we're talking about when I talk about participant observation fieldwork, that's just, history and anthropology are very intimately related disciplines. I mean, they're called sister disciplines, right? I asked the professor one time in history, because we were reading a lot of social theory, and I asked him, I said, where do you draw the line? Where does history end and anthropology begin, and vice versa? He looked at me and he said, wherever you want to draw that line.
Wow.
And so, historians use different research techniques. I mean, largely it's, you go and you research in a library or documents or archives, right? And then you interpret the findings, and then you present them.
Mm-hmm.
In anthropology, especially in cultural anthropology and ethnographic field work, when you're going out into the field to immerse yourself within a cultural setting, and that can be, a temporary, that can be a few days, it could be a few hours, it could be years, and it's a completely different data collection vantage point. You're going in and you're living amongst the group that you're trying to understand, and then you collect data, right? Then you write it up or you present it. But I want to say that, for me, it was, so when I entered grad school, I entered because I wanted to teach more. I wanted to teach anthropology. So the visual anthropology track allowed me to fast track that degree, right? So I was done within a year and a half. And so the thing with that was I needed a topic because I had to make a film. And so I was trying to find a topic. And as it turned out, I ended up doing the life history of a friend of mine, Carlos Caro, who is a Cuban immigrant, and he's a master Afro-Cuban percussionist.
Wow.
And so I basically did a mini documentary on his life story. And so it took me 1 year to make like a 9-minute film.
Wow.
Yeah. And so the first semester was doing the field work, and the second semester was recording, filming, editing, and then ultimately presenting the work and showing the work. But that first semester was all dedicated to participant observation field work.
Wow.
And so every Thursday night, that was in a bar in the Mission District of San Francisco. So my friends were talking about like, hey man, can we come do field work with you? Right.
What a place to do field work. The Mission District in San Francisco is so historical, but I hear what you're saying about how closely related history and anthropology are. In fact, this podcast on Apple iTunes falls under the category of history and culture because they have that category together. It's not history or culture. It's under the category of history and culture. So that just kind of further illustrates your point of how closely tied, the two are together. Now, you mentioned, starting off your field work and the first type of sort of formalized project that you did involving anthropological theory and whatnot. Are there certain data pieces that you always know to collect, or are there certain data pieces that are golden nuggets when you're doing your field work, like something like maybe people's names that you have to take account? But are there any is there like a structure that you go off of when you're doing your field work, or do you kind of just take notes as you go and then see what happens?
So, I mean, before you even get into the field, you don't just grab a clipboard and a pen and get out there, right? I mean, there's a whole, you have to first of all, you have to formulate a research question. You have to do an ethnohistory, and for those who don't know what an ethnohistory is, you need to basically do an historical study around your topic and your research question. That will also inform the researcher of what's been done and what hasn't been done. Holes in the research, unanswered questions, not only what's there, but also like what's the negative space look like, to use artistic terminology, what isn't there, and then that will kind of, inform your vantage point in terms of how you might want to go about conducting the work and what you're trying to find out. Okay. So then you go into the field. And so what I try to do when I'm doing my research, when I'm collecting my data, and I even hate talking like this because what it does, there's a very dehumanizing aspect to that, right? Where, I'm going to show up in a white lab coat and I'm going to study you. And then I'm going to go back to, to the lab and, write it up. I hate that shit. I mean, because we're talking about people's lives.
Yeah.
We're talking about people's lives,
For sure.
You have to build a rapport, right? You have to build a rapport. You have to gain people's trust. You can't just show up and start documenting, in some contexts, you get your ass kicked, or, people start looking at you funny. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah. Who's this guy? Were you judging us, man? What are you doing? What are you writing in there?
It depends, I mean, there's a great book. I don't know if you've read it. It's written by a guy named Bill Buford. It's called Among the Thugs.
Among the Thugs. No, I haven't read it, sir.
This guy's he's a sociologist, and we won't hold that against him. And he was waiting for the train with his wife, and they made an announcement in the station: please step back, soccer train arriving next. And he was like, soccer train, why do we have to step back? Everybody steps back. And this train pulls up and it's full of soccer hooligans. Like full, because, in England, like it's almost like a street gang mentality around, soccer club.
Yeah, they have straight up brawls, like group brawls.
And that piqued his curiosity. He was like, what? He was like, oh, I got to study this. So he ended up going back to England and he wrote this book called Among the Thugs about that particular subculture. You know what I mean? And so, you know, you don't like, he couldn't just jump on the train with his, you know, his moleskin journal and his pen and start like, you know, hey, let me interview you, you know, there, put that in your notebook, you know? So you have to build a rapport. And that's very, very tricky, you know, because, you know, to gain people's trust, that's a very, very delicate thing. Where I had an advantage with Carlos is that I met Carlos when he first got to California from Mexico, but from, you know, Cuba to Mexico, then here. Mm-hmm. And I'd known Carlos for years, and we actually worked together musically. And so I had, you know, it wasn't, he knew that I wasn't going to do him wrong, or, you know, I had full access to his life, including his family, mm-hmm. you know, his home.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that's a big deal. I mean, that's sacred space. So
trust, a lot of trust there, rapport, like you're saying.
Excuse me, a lot of trust. So, you know, so it's not always that easy though. And so when we were, and then, so then I would have to go and do the field work and then write up the notes. So at that time, you know, I drank, and so we would be in the club, me and my team, watching and observing. And so I'm not taking notes in real time. You know, I have like a small notebook, like the spiral, the one that flips up, mm-hmm. just something that would fit into my back pocket. Mm-hmm. And discreetly, I would turn around and make my notes where no one could see, or I would go to the bathroom and write stuff down and come back. So my MO in the field is for people to never see me taking notes, because that helps to mitigate any kind of performance anxiety that people might have when they know they're being interviewed. I mean, even right now, I feel like, you know, there's certain things that I can say, I can't say. I have to be mindful of a lot of different things right now, you know. Mm-hmm. I can't totally just let fly, you know, and just, you know, be sitting here in my boxer shorts. I mean, well, I could, but I'm not. You know? But you know what I mean? I mean, it's like there are some certain, you know, cultural parameters that we have to be mindful of, right?
Of course.
And when people are being interviewed and they know they're being interviewed, then the filtration system might be calibrated in a different way than if we're just having a conversation, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So
it's kind of crazy how that works, because, you know, I'm no expert in like theoretical physics or anything like that. But from the few things that I have read, even atoms change when there's an observer. Like even basic particles of life, as soon as an observer enters the point, whether that be the scientist or something like that, the atoms behave differently. So something as complex as humans and human behavior, if we are aware that, you know, somebody is starting to study us, or we caught on to, hey, this person's trying to learn something about me, then of course, like you're saying, we are naturally going to behave a little bit differently. And maybe there might be some folks who completely just don't give a fuck, and maybe they're like, you know, the same all the way, but that's probably rare, right? Very rare. Yeah, people will change when they know something's on to them or someone.
Well, think about this. Remember, when I was in elementary school, the school principal would make their rounds every now and then, and even in high school, the principal would walk around and maybe, you know, pop in, lean in the door, you know, observe a little bit.
Yeah,
man, everybody sits a little straighter, everybody gets a little quieter, a little more well behaved, right?
Yeah,
it's kind of the same concept, you know, it's because you know you're being watched.
For sure. Or when the police roll up behind you, and even though you're not doing anything wrong, you get up straight.
Yeah, when the cops come behind you, man, your halo kind of shines a little brighter.
I'm just the average citizen, just on my way, sir.
Hey, I'm just 10 and 2 doing 25 right here.
Yeah. No, that's totally true. I think of like my field work as an archaeologist, which is like a little bit different because the material objects are no longer animate. So they don't have that sort of worldview shift of like, hey, this person's on to me, right? So when I take notes, I mean, I use my phone and I just do voice records of like soil type, soil color, you know, soil matrix and whatnot, what I'm seeing. So it's a little bit different when there's that human aspect that's involved. Have you ever experienced anything doing field work that was sort of like, maybe it made you not scared, but it like rocked your world, or you're like, man, this is a dangerous situation, or I shouldn't be here? Like, have you ever encountered anything kind of crazy? Because when people think of archaeology, they think of Indiana Jones. So they happen to think that for whatever reason, we're out, you know, with AKs and running from boulders and shit like that. But have you ever experienced any sort of strife in the field? Anything that made you question, like, fuck, should I be here right now?
Well, by the way, that bullwhip, you know, you could just turn around and whip the boulder, right? That's what the bullet's for, right?
Yeah.
It's crazy, man.
Flint napping. That's flint napping.
Yeah, you know, so the thing is that so when I did the film on Carlos, I mean, my background as a musician, as somebody who has been, you know, around music production, very comfortable on stages, very comfortable, you know, in a musical environment. So, my team, not so much. So I would, you know, we're making a film, right? So I would nudge my film, because I was paired with two film students. So I nudge him and I go, hey, you know, jump up on the stage and, you know, let's get B-roll on just his hands playing the cowbell. Just get that. And they would look at me and they would go, now? I'm like, yeah, now, go. I'm like, come on, man, the song's gonna end. Because by this point, I knew the entire repertoire, because the band would play on the rotation. And so I'm like, you know, they're gonna end, man. Get it. And then they would be all like timid about jumping up on the stage, even though we had, you know, the free pass, full access, stage, any, you know, I mean, the band leaders knew who we were and what we were doing. The management, the clubs, everybody knew what we were doing, but they wouldn't do it. So I would go, give me the camera, and I would jump up on there. I would jump up on the stage, get the shot, be mindful of the cables and the, you know, stage monitors and all of that. Where they were afraid that they were going to fall. They didn't want to, you know. So it was like that. So and then I would write that up in my field notes, right? And so my professor asked me, he was like, you know, hey, are you cool with your team? Because, you know, I'm concerned, his words, I'm concerned about, you know, the degrees of, you know, where you're at on the emic bullseye, because you are coming from such an emic perspective, and these guys from an edic perspective, right? The insider versus the outsider perspective. And so I was right in my element and perfectly comfortable, right? And where these guys were not so much, I'm like, no, it's fine. You know, they're getting it. It's just, you know, sometimes you just got to grab the camera and do it yourself, you know? So, you know, wrap the film, hard stop. Now I'm like, okay, now I'm going to make the film I always wanted to make, which was, you know, low riding in Northern California, right? And so I had to do a hard shift. It had been a long time since I had owned a car. I didn't really know anybody in the scene in the Bay Area because I was focused on school. I'm talking about low riding.
Okay.
You know, and then there was a huge car show at the Cow Palace, you know, which is a, you know, big venue in San Francisco. And I went, and I was completely, you know, feeling out of my element, even though this was something that I had grown up with. You know, it was just, I was sensing some culture shock. I was feeling culture shock.
Wow.
Right. And like, you know, anxiety about talking to people, second guessing myself about like, why would these people ever want me to participate? Why would they ever allow me to interview them? Like I started to really, really overthink and second guess, start to almost mini meltdown in real time. And then I was looking at this car, and this guy came up behind me, and he was like, man, they don't make them like this anymore. And I looked over, I'm like, no, they don't. I didn't even look. I just said, no, they don't. And I looked over, and he was wearing a car club shirt. So I started to rap with this guy, and then I told him what I was about, what I was doing. He was like, come on, man, I want to take you to meet my club president and vice president. who was a married couple, Gabe and Lisette Mijares, and they were members of Socios Car Club in Sacramento. And I started talking to them, and I'm still in contact with them to this day. I ended up buying a car that Gabe Mijares owned, wow. Right? So, it ended up just being like kind of one of those things. But, but at first I was feeling like really, really, disjointed, and I was feeling culture shock. That was small potatoes in comparison to like being in a favela in Brazil and the guide saying to you, if you hear gunshots, don't panic, just get down, stay calm, and just stay with me, and I'll get us out of here. And then, and that's after seeing police wearing like combat gear, like they're dressed for all out warfare. That you're not riding It's a Small World at Disneyland.
It's real.
And so, but I never felt like, oh man, I shouldn't be here. It was just that, the senses are heightened, or, being, at a meetup, at a lowrider meetup, and then, a fight pops off, right? And then suddenly, people come back with guns. Right. And I don't want to like, overly portray low riding in a negative light, but that's part of the reality of what happens when people get together and there's drinking involved, and there's people who are not necessarily coming for the family atmosphere, but in fact are looking for trouble. So, it has happened. Not so much that I shouldn't be here, but okay, if you want to be here, this is part of, what goes along with being here.
Yeah. And I say like shouldn't be here because I've experienced culture shock on the field as well. And I'm only saying that because I've also had instances where I question that, like, should I be here? Like, what am I doing here? My culture shock on the fieldwork came in Spain, actually. So I did some fieldwork in Spain, and it was quite interesting. It was an amazing field school that we did. We were working on necropolis, which was like a city of a bunch of buried dead people. And one of the necropoli had about, I want to say, up to like 200 graves. So it was a great opportunity for students to, go to Spain, excavate in these graves in the necropoli, and then, do some research, write up on it, and then, go on with their careers. So we were in Spain. We were on a small island of Menorca, Spain. And I had always known that Spain had crazy festivals, but I had never been to Spain. I had never been to one of these crazy festivals. And I believe I was in my mid-20s, like 25, 26 years old, somewhere around there. And lo and behold, about towards the end of the field school, we're walking around the little town. We're on a small island of Menorca, Spain, right? It's one of the Balearic Islands off the coast. And so we're walking around the small little town, and all these shopkeepers are like boarding up their windows. And I'm like, what's going on here? Like, everybody is like boarding up their windows, and floods of people just keep coming. They keep coming. And so we were in Spain for an archaeological dig, but this was something that was not related to archaeology, but we're anthropologists. So we're in a foreign country, and bunch of people coming. So this festival happens, and it was entirely overwhelming, the amount of people that had just encompassed the island, like out of nowhere. I think the population went from a couple of thousand to like 30, 40,000, like insane amount of people. People from all ages, high school kids coming, and everybody just getting really, really drunk, which is cool. Like, I love to party. I love me a good time. But this good time was unlike any good time I had seen, because just like the sheer amount of people and alcohol, and it was just a free for all. And I was like, this is kind of interesting. And what did it for me was I saw a group of Spanish men approach a group of young Spanish teenage girls, and these girls were very, very young, like clearly teenagers, and these men were much older. And the men the way the men approached the women, you know, to say, hey, how you doing, was they walk up and they literally just grabbed her face and started telling her how beautiful she was and started kissing on her neck. And the girls were very, very uncomfortable and they were very young. And as an anthropologist, I'm just observing, right, and thinking, how would this fly in America? Like, although I wasn't being American centric, and I didn't go up to him and say, hey, no, you can't do that, sir, stop, right? I would never, you know, unless there was some obvious physical violence going along. But it just seemed like that was the culture of the festival, and that was okay, and that was tolerant behavior. And that type of behavior just kept going on, and we saw another instance and another instance, and then even younger, and it was just, I had this moment where I looked around and I realized I'm not in the United States. I'm not in my country. I'm not in my home. And there's so much going on around me that even with my anthropological training, I don't really know how to understand and process all of this that's going on. And it's funny because you're like, wow, I'm supposed to be a trained anthropologist, but I'm feeling all these things of uncomfort, and I have to put my training to work now and still be a polite individual, even though I am essentially culture shock, like you said. So it's not easy. It's not always easy, and it sounds sexy and it sounds attractive and it sounds like, yeah, we could go here and we could do these amazing things and study these really cool things. We could take amazing photos and videos and bring back and share these experiences. But sometimes we have these experiences and they're a little bit rough, but they're beautiful experiences because you grow from that, and it makes me a better person, and it made me, you know, a better anthropologist, a better archaeologist. At least I feel like it did. So it's definitely not always easy, man. It's not always just an easy journey to go out and do a bunch of field work.
Well, and I think that, like, you know, when you're in a place that you're not from, you know, a culture that's different than your own, you know, when you are a guest in somebody else's culture,
mm-hmm.
I think is a better way of putting it.
Yeah, great way.
Right. You know, I remember, like, my first trip to Cuba was in 1996, 1997.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to go to Cuba because, you know, when I was an undergrad going to community college, in my Latin American history class, my professor assigned country case studies. Everybody wanted Cuba. I wanted Brazil, actually, and he assigned Cuba to me. You know, and you know, people were like fighting over Cuba, and he was like, nope, John's doing it. And I went, what the hell? You know, but what he ended up doing to a great degree, I believe this was opening the door to my destiny, really, because I did the country case study, and then I continued my thirst and my hunger, really, for understanding Cuba in a more elaborate way. He really put me on the path to become a Latin American historian. And so I kept going on my own. I kept researching. So I had read probably about 100 books and articles. So I had read, and I don't mean like glanced at, I mean read like 100 sources on Cuban history, culture, and politics.
Wow.
So I went, okay, nothing else to do now but go. I got to go,
mm-hmm.
right? So I sold my 64 Impala, and I went to Cuba to study Spanish at the University of Havana for a month. And it was what I thought I knew about the world could fit on the head of a pin.
Wow.
It was a game changer, man. It took my understanding of life and turned it on upside down, you know?
How so?
Well, so for example, like, so I had all of these, you know, it's funny because, you know, we talk about armchair anthropologists, right? the early, you know, rich guys, you know, white guys that, you know, with massive libraries, right?
They didn't really do shit.
Right. Other than misinterpret indigenous people, right? So I went to Cuba, and I was like, okay, any culture that is absent of racism, I gotta go see. Like that's a utopia for me. There's no racism in Cuba. I gotta go because everything I read, Cuba has eradicated racism.
Interesting.
Racial equality. Right? We land. I get to the airport and I'm like racism. Like right out of the gate, I'm like racism. And we're like, okay, check that one off, right? So and on and on and on, right? And so I was there a month and just learned like, things happen at a different pace, right? We are so impatient, and we're so reduced to like a fast food, happy meal, everything happens super quick, little sound bites, and on to the next and whatnot. And it's like, for example, went to the Palacio de la Salsa, which is a famous salsa club in the Hotel Riviera in Havana, which was owned by Meyer Lansky, I believe. Back in the 50s when the mob was running Havana. And so I went and the band was supposed to start at 10 o'clock. And so I was like, well, got to get a good seat. Let's go at 9, right? So I get there and nobody's there. They took my cover charge. I went in, nobody in the venue. And then there was one couple, like a foreigner with a Cuban. And it was just the three of us in there for a long time. The house was going on. They were dancing, but then, then a couple more people started to trickle in. The foreigners were coming in, and it got to be 10 o'clock. Hardly anybody in the club. 10:30, 11 o'clock, it started to fill up a little more. 11:30 started to fill up a little more. 12, 12:30. I'd been there since 9. It's 12:30. Nothing. Right? Go, what's going on? So finally I'm like, man, I'm tired. Forget this. The band didn't go on until 1 a.m.
Damn.
10 o'clock start time. 1 o'clock in the morning they started. Right?
Waiting forever.
Right. And and it wasn't until I did my film on Carlos that I started to understand why. Because at that time he was living there and he was playing and he was talking to me about like his personal commute coming from another province into Havana, which would be like, 50 minutes by car, but it's like 4 hours by, public transit.
Whoa.
And so, not everything happens, in such a monochromatic way like we're used to it happening.
Yeah. Especially in Cali, probably. Cali's moves fast.
Right. And things will happen at whenever 30, for a whole host of reasons. Right. So for example, like my Spanish tutor told me, she was like, you got to go see my boyfriend's band play. And I said, where do they play? They play at the Copacabana Hotel in Miramar, which is a neighborhood kind of in the outskirts. It's not right in the thick of things in Havana. It's like a 15, 20-minute cab ride, whatever. Mm. So I get in the cab and I say, take me to Copacabana. And at the time, I wasn't familiar with Cuba. It was my first trip. I had no idea where we were going. Now I would know, hey, no, you took a wrong turn there. No, right. I would be able to tell them how to get there.
Okay.
Right. At the time, I was flying blind. So I'm like, I don't know where we're going. We get there and I tell them to wait because it was late and there was no cabs around. And tourism, it was 1997, right? So the tourism wasn't like it is today, right? So I said, wait for me. So I go into the hotel. There's no band playing. And so I go up to the front desk. I said, hey, isn't there supposed to be a band playing? They said, oh, no, they canceled tonight. I went, okay. So the next day when I saw my tutor, I said, what happened? She goes, oh, the flute player got his flute stolen. So the band canceled.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Like,
oh, no.
And that's how stuff happens. And that was like my whole month, right? Like, there were so check this out. This is a funny story. So in my hotel, the first meal, black bean soup, fish, white rice. Oh man, this black bean soup's incredible. The next day, black bean soup, fish, and rice. And we get to have it again. Third day. Okay, well, black bean soup's good, but
Yeah.
Fourth day. 10th day.
Same.
I'll just get a cheese sandwich at the bar. I'll buy my dinner.
Yeah. That's crazy. I don't know. Same for y'all too. Same food.
So then I was like, man, I'm going to ride my bike because I rented a bike for the month that I was there. I'm going to ride my bike down to the gas station because they had like this microwavable. It was almost like a Hot Pocket pizza like thing, right? So, I order the thing. The guy turns around, puts it in the microwave for like 3 minutes. It gets to be like 2.5 minutes. Woo. Power outage. Blackout. And I'm like, and then I'll just take it like that. He's like, nope, sorry, we're closed. And I'm like, no, closed? Like, here's my money. He was like, nope, I can't take it. We're closed.
Damn.
Like, let me leave you the money and give me the thing and I'll take it. I'll eat it like that. He was like, I can't do it. We're closed.
Wow.
And I was like, man. So when I got home after the month, that was back, it was 97. So you could meet your party right at the gate at the airport, right? Pre 9/11, right?
Yep.
And so my wife and her friend picked me up and she goes, don't kill me. You're going to be so mad. And I was like, what happened? She goes, my car got towed. And I go, okay. I go, well, is there money to get it out of the impound? She goes, yeah. I go, well, let's go get it. And she goes, you're not mad? I said, no. How are you not mad? I said, my whole month has been like that. You know what I mean? Where like now, if that happened, I would be like, totally upset, right?
Yeah.
Like, let's go get it. In other words, it's a perspective of, it's really not that big a deal, right? And it's like, count your blessings. Shit, you have a car, you have the money.
Yep.
There's food in the fridge. Not everybody can say that. And I think that, that is, part of being in an environment is different because, then you start to buffalo culture shock. It goes the other way too, man, because culture shock, it gets referred to as reverse culture shock. Like when you come out of the field.
Yeah.
I mean, that happened my second trip was in 2000. And I was working at, the store Papyrus?
It sounds familiar. I don't know the exact store, but it sounds familiar.
Or the brand Papyrus, it's like a high-end like greeting card.
Yeah.
So I worked at the flagship store when I was in grad school at the Embarcadero Center in San Francisco. So it's a big, like, cushy mall in the, the thick of the financial district of San Francisco. And there I am, like, helping people. So I had just gotten back from Cuba, and this woman came in. She wanted help with her engagement party or invitations. So I'm sitting there helping her, and I literally had just gotten back. And she had a rock on her finger like this big. That thing was huge, diamond on her finger. And she was totally upset because her engagement party invitations were messed up. And she's just like talking. She's pissed. And I'm sitting there like thinking about coming back from seeing people living in extreme poverty.
Yeah.
With real problems, all kinds of shortages in terms of resources, running water, food.
Real shit.
Yeah. And I went, hold on one second. I went in the back room, took off my apron, hung it up, clocked out, and just walked out. I go, somebody else gonna have to help her.
Wow.
I go, I'm out.
Wow.
And they're like, what? I go, I quit. I'll be back on payday to get my paycheck. And she was like, you can't leave. I'm like, somebody else will help you. I just bounced. I just couldn't deal with like this. I was sitting there listening to her just jaw.
Yeah.
Like, this is your biggest problem. Your biggest problem. It was too much for me.
Yeah, that's that reverse culture shock like you're talking about though, when you realize like, wow, I'm back in this environment with all these entitled ass motherfuckers. Like, no, I got to get out of here. This is too much. This is way too much.
My homie, my really good friend, the first time he went to Cuba was like 1980 when nobody was going to Cuba, 80, 81. And he said that when he got home from Cuba, he couldn't get out of bed for a week.
Why is that?
He was so messed up about being back home, because culture shock is a sliding scale of it can be just like some like just discomfort of being in a different environment, but full blown depression, right? There's like that big of a range,
straight up depression
of how it affects people, what I mean?
Yeah, so. Straight up depression. Even traveling itself sometimes can bring about a travel depression, even if there is maybe culture shock has to factor into that travel depression or reverse culture shock where you get back home and you're kind of tripping like, I really missed that place, or that place was so beautiful or something. It's a brilliant point what you make when you say that sort of when you're in these places where you're experiencing discomfort, then you are able to better handle discomfort, period. It's like it's quite simple, right? Like you get used to just being in a constant position of like, okay, where am I going to go next, or what's going to happen. So I always think like recently I've been doing this thing where at the end of my showers I put on a freezing cold shower. Like I like to take a nice warm shower, and then at the very end I turn it on freezing cold and I just shock the shit out of my body. And at first your body freaks out and it's like, oh my God, what's going on? And I can't breathe. It's literally like it's hard to breathe, and it's like, oh my gosh. And then eventually it kind of levels out and I'm able to breathe, and then it's fine. And I'm like, oh, it's all good. It's just cold water. That's all that happens. I'm regular and it's just cold water. So when I have these travel experiences and able to go to these different places, like you're saying, you're then able to bring that back with you and then apply it to your everyday life, like you're saying. And that's pretty crazy that you just quit your job right then and there. You walked out and you're like, you know what? Fuck this. I can't deal with this lady anymore because this lady's priorities are just all screwed up. You question, and this is if something that you've experienced or not, but what is the right time, or when is the appropriate time for somebody to do field work? Because when I was in a community college, I always wanted to do field work on the rave scene because I was like big into raving at the time. And the rave culture, I think, is quite interesting because of the amount of crazy people in the rave culture, the drug usage, the music. Like from an anthropological perspective, rave culture is like, there's so much to study. So I was a little young dude in PCC, right, in Pasadena City College, being like, I want to study raves. And my professors were like, that's awesome, but just wait until you're at like a certain level and then you're able to study raves. Like, what do you think about that? Like, do you have any recommendations for your students if they're like, I want to go out and I want to study this? Like, is there ways or ways to get into field work that are not so risk heavy at first? Or what do you think? Like, what advice do you give to your students?
Well, first of all, if so, like personally and pedagogically, I like encouraging people to study what they want to study. You know what I mean? I think that, part of the, I get, from the student standpoint and that curiosity and that want, I understand your perspective, but now at this point in my life and career, I also understand your professor's perspective as well. Maybe, sometimes I think when you're so close and so attached to the culture that you want to study, that could pose challenges, right? Your professors might have been trying to protect you given, your maturity or lack thereof at the time. Maybe that, in more advanced studies, you would have a more refined toolkit and better poised to ask more informed questions. It was interesting because, like the first researcher I encountered, a buddy of my compadre, actually, his son's my godson. Me and this dude go back to junior high.
Wow.
He was a body piercer up in Portland, Oregon, and he and his piercing community had this event on December 11th every year, and they just called it December 11th. And he was like, "Hey, man, I really want you to come up, and I really want you to see what we do." And I'm like, "Okay, cool, I'll come up." So I went up there, and they were doing suspension.
Oh, whoa!
Yeah, they were doing suspension. They were doing pulls. You want
to describe suspensions real quick to folks who may be listening and don't know what that is?
Yeah, so basically, people, they would put meat hooks in people and hang. Either like off of the back shoulder blades, or full blown horizontal suspension with pulleys and racks and shit. And I was like,
that's full hanging, no feet touching the ground, no ladders,
full on
skin stretching
off. Yeah, like and then like hypodermic needles, like doing art on people's back, like full back, like spiraling with needle insertion.
Wow, I haven't seen that one.
Or like, a metal skewer, like in one cheek and out the other, and then walking around like my comadre was walking around with this metal skewer
sick
through her cheek, like, and I'm like, all right.
How you drink water?
What's that?
How you drink water? Is it good?
Well, like, I'm not a prude, but I was definitely out of my element. Like, I couldn't really relate to it at all, other than, like my boy was just like so like proud of what they were doing. It was the first time I had ever eaten vegan food, right? And I was like,
what'd you eat?
I don't vegan food. I remember it wasn't enough. I tried it to be cool. I didn't want to be like, but I tend to eat higher up the food chain. So I was like, hey man, is there a taqueria around here? Because I gotta have some meat, and so I ended up going. But there was a woman there who was getting her master's thesis, and she was writing it on body piercing, and so she was there doing field work. So I was talking to her just, about her work and whatnot, but she was in the field, but she was very, clinical and there, sitting in the corner, and I'm thinking like, man, like in retrospect, they should have put a hook in her back. So she could have felt what it was like, that struggle for the emic, that getting, because you can write about it. You can write about it, but I think if they had put a skewer through her cheek, she would have had a different perspective about things.
For sure.
And so, but that was like the first researcher that I had met, and it was funny. But as far as like, my students go, I do a research exercise. Like I do a field work exercise and a methods class. Like we go to the mall. And I have them go into 5 stores that they've never been into. And then they document like how they felt walking in, walking around, the engagement or lack thereof with the staff, right? But what I tell them is no matter what, don't show up with binders and clipboards or notebooks, and inevitably people do, they start writing down in the store, and then people freak out. Sometimes they get kicked out, but I've yet to have a student come to me, and say, I want to go out in the field and study X. You know what I'm saying? I mean, they might write on an anthropological topic, but it's more of doing that ethno-history, right? It's very preliminary, so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's, what I think that what's important with any research, and I actually want to talk about this right now, is the importance of the human subjects protocol, right? Because the human subjects protocol is basically, the contract you have with your institution that basically says that you're making a positive contribution, that the people in question are going to benefit from your study and your findings, and they won't be exploited in the process. I think that that's the ethical checks and balances in the research process is very, very necessary to adhere to, and that way, because anthropologists historically have gotten a bad rap, and rightfully so.
Yep.
Because they have historically sold out their quote unquote subjects, or the people that they have become expert in knowing about. If you're talking about, the Vietnam War and the CIA putting anthropologists on the payroll to use them for intelligence and interpretation, wow. Right? That completely negates why we do this. I mean, anthropologists taking advantage of indigenous people in the field, his going way back to having sexual relations, with women because it was men conducting the field work, and then, or, reinforcing racist stereotypes on the back end of the research.
Yeah. Or even worse, going after the children of the village, because there's a lot of anthropologists, unfortunately, there's stories and accounts of folks who did that shit too, man.
Right. But, I mean, like you're going back to your question about should I be here? I mean, I think the reoccurring question for anthropologists in the field is, at what point do I have a right to speak on what I disagree with in the field? In other words, how can I be here and not disrupt the cultural flow here? You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, we're there temporarily.
Yep. Visitors.
I mean, very few people, quote unquote, go native, and this has been a problem, particularly with feminist anthropologists being in cultures where female circumcision is a cultural practice.
Oh, that's
right?
Wow.
I mean, that's a big deal, right? Whew. That's a big deal, and my professor at San Francisco State, he was working on a film with a guy who was an alleged santero, or practitioner of Santeria in New Jersey.
Okay.
The name of the film is called Yo Soy Hechicero, I Am Sorcerer. And he asked me what I thought of the film. And African-based religion throughout the diaspora is one of my quote unquote, fields of expertise. And he said, "What'd you think of the film?" And I said, "I don't know." I said, because my knowledge of Santeria is not necessarily shown, in my understanding of things, it's unclear as what he's doing. But I would need to see every minute of raw footage in order to get a better idea of what he's doing. But he was telling me that when they were doing the film, that the guy was cutting people with a dirty knife.
Whoa.
And they as a production were worried about that, because they were like, he could infect people, they could be transmitting, a whole host of viruses, including HIV and AIDS at the time. So people may or may not have their tetanus shots. Like, at what point? So what they did is they just encouraged him to use a clean blade. right? Because they were freaked out about what he was doing in terms of a cultural practice, number one. But then they were like, okay, we got to check ourselves now. So how do we intervene without being completely intrusive, right? So they encouraged the guy to use a clean blade, right? That way, that would help to mitigate some of those potential transmissions.
And how did that individual take that encouragement? Was he receptive to it?
Receptive.
Okay.
Receptive.
Cool.
Receptive. Because it was allegedly happening under this altered state of consciousness, like a spirit possession or whatever. So I don't know, man. But it is a problem. Like, you know, at what point, you know, am I, you know,
is it appropriate?
Yeah. At what point am I potentially being culturally intrusive here or ethnocentric?
Yeah, that's a super valid question. Super valid question. And that question will be addressed again on the podcast numerous times, especially with culture anthropologists and individuals like yourself. So thank you so much for posing that question, and thanks for being on. And as always, man, I have to give you a chance to share your social media so that people can follow you if that's what they want to do, and they can see your awesome photos.
So are you wrapping me up then? Are we a wrap?
Yes, sir. We're wrapping it up.
Did we talk about anything? Is there anything of value here?
I hope so. I hope so. People learning about spikes going in cheeks and shit like that.
Yeah. I just want to say something before we wrap.
What's up?
You know, I think that, you know, when we're in the field, you know, and we're dealing with culture shock, and we might be homesick, and we might, you know, be looking for cultural familiarity. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, there are all kinds of different tricks, you know, that we have. You know, we carry photographs. I mean, I think that nowadays, you know, social media and the internet helps us keep connected, but we can't always take for granted that we're going to have, you know, immediate access to a Wi-Fi connection or what have you.
Yep.
You know, when I was in Japan doing field work for my globalization of low riding project, you know, I was starting to like melt down in Tokyo because it was just like, you know, cultural I mean, it was just like sensory overload at the density and the pace of things, you know. And it was funny because I was like, I need to just get off the street. And I found myself getting off the street by going into a McDonald's.
I was about to say that. Go to McDonald's, eat a freaking Big Mac or chicken nuggets.
It wasn't even like that. I just ordered a cup of coffee and I just needed to sit down. Mm-hmm. And then I started to trip out about how McDonald's was functioning in Japan. So, you know, I mean, even though we think that, you know, we might be having some cultural refuge in one of those familiar places, man, you know, you're not home. So anyway.
Yeah, that's so crazy. My wife and I always say that, like whenever we're traveling abroad and I'm getting a little bit of homesick or whatever, I'll go to the nearest McDonald's, because there's most definitely probably a McDonald's wherever we're at traveling, and just being inside a McDonald's, smelling that smell. And the menus are a little bit different, right? They have like regional items, you know, wherever you're at. Like some McDonald's in Europe sell beer, and some have you know, like fish and egg rolls and whatnot. But I use that trick also. So yeah, man, go ahead, please share your social media for folks so they could check out your amazing stories and follow along with your car build as well.
Right on, man. So you know, find me on Instagram, lowride_x_worldwide, or if you just type in lowride worldwide, you'll see the LW. And that's my brand and my logo, and you'll find me there.
Okay, cool. And as always, John, I like to ask folks 2 questions at the very end of each podcast. And I already asked you these 2 questions, and you answered them beautifully the last time. But the first question was, where do you think we're headed next in our phase of evolution? Have you got a chance to think about that, or, you know, are you pleading the fifth? What you think?
Man, I don't mean to point my finger.
That's okay.
But my answer was, you know, the pandemic's crazy, and we talked about virus mutation. Mm-hmm. And look at, here we are, you know, a month or 2 later, and we're seeing the new strain.
The UK variant.
Right. We're seeing the variations that are more aggressive, man. So, you know, where are we going? I have no idea, man. You know, I mean, the insurrection and the attempted coup on the Capitol happened. You know, where are we headed? I don't know, man. I think that where we're headed is we're headed. I think, especially as this thing continues to ramp up. I think where we're headed is that our way of life is really being tested on the whole. I think that our understanding or misunderstanding of democracy is showing its fragility, and so it'll be interesting to see where we're headed with that. I mean, certainly Marx predicted capitalism's failure, and I think that our brand of democracy goes hand in hand with capitalism. And so, I think that, we are really living in uncertain times. And what's interesting is that, human hardship unites people. Historically, when we look at the Great Depression, when we look at, times of war,
post 9/11,
9/11 for sure, those things, people will, we're social creatures. We need each other, and so, people will show those bonding characteristics. Those social fabrics can be reinforced at times, or it can divide people, in an individualistic get yours mentality. So I don't know where we're headed. Some people are scared by it. I think, as someone who has committed their life to studying human beings, I say, human beings trip me out. That's why I've dedicated my life to studying them.
Oh yeah, me too.
Right. It'll be interesting to see where we're headed, but I think that we need to certainly tighten our seatbelts, cinch them up, because this ride, I think, is going to ebb and flow a little bit. I think that flat line of complacency has come to an end, and now we're seeing a lot of dynamics, particularly our place in the geopolitical schema as well.
Totally.
We as a society are no longer that shining beacon of hope and light. The world's looking at us going, welcome to our world.
Yeah.
So that's my answer. So again, answering without answering.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. And what's your favorite thing about people, man?
Oof.
Or one of your favorite things about people?
Favorite thing about people? I think that culture is dynamic. There's a lot that we haven't gotten to, and I think that culture, the dynamics of culture, and language as an example of demonstrating the fluidity of culture, I think is really fantastic and always piques my curiosity. I love how people communicate, verbally and non-verbally, visually. I think it's interesting. So I think that my favorite thing about people is learning about them, right? In terms of, trying to see, how people behave, and incorporating that good, bad, or the ugly into my own understanding of the world, because our cultural decks are constantly being shuffled and reshuffled, and I think that that's very, very interesting to me. Is to look at how people live and go, okay, that's not how I live, but what can I understand, by looking at that, and then ultimately how can I incorporate that into my better self-understanding.
Wow. I like that a lot, man. Yeah, I totally like that a lot. And that kind of relates to where we're headed, what you were saying, where we are headed in our overall evolution, and like how the different ways we could go and what ways that we could go. And for a long time I said that you said it brilliantly, that our cultural decks are being shuffled up. For a long time, I would say pre 2016, pre-Trump era, I would say for a long time Man, Americans were so comfortable. We're so comfortable. We're so comfortable. We hadn't had like a really big event to shake us up and really rock our world and question and cause us to question, like who we are as a society. And that's exactly what's going on right now. We've had so many events, from 2016 on that have really caused us to rethink the fabric of our society. Not only that, but like you mentioned, now the way the world looks at us now, like people are probably people in other countries are probably turning on the news in the U.S. going, what are these crazy fucking Americans up to today, man? It's like a show.
Yeah.
Which was crazy because that wasn't the case for a long time. So thank you so much for sharing those thoughts, and thank you for sharing those sentiments, and thank you again for being on and sharing all your knowledge, man. Like I said, this is definitely not the last time we're going to do this. We're going to do this a lot more. I know that you have so much more to share as well.
Thank you, man. And again, I love what you're doing with the podcast and Anthro for the homies.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you very much for listening to that episode of Anthro for the Homies. I mean, shit, if you made it this far and you listened to the whole episode, then you're definitely the homie. And just a reminder to all the homies of where you can follow me on social media. You can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at Anthro for the Homies. I also have a website that sort of serves like a landing page where you could view the different episode listings and different thumbnails and descriptions of the episode. It's anthroforthehomies.podbean.com, and there's also a Podbean app in which you could listen to other podcasts and comment and like and leave different reviews for each episode. So it's pretty cool. And just a reminder, if you could please help me get the word out about this podcast, that would be great. Let 5 or 10 or even 20 of your homies know about this podcast. Please hit subscribe, please share the episodes, and I'd really appreciate it. This is a one-man show. I'm your host and your producer and everything else. So bear with me as I work through the technical difficulties of starting up a podcast. I'm realizing, the limitations of certain equipment and making adjustments as necessary. So I'd really appreciate it, and tune into the next one. Thank you very much.